Thank you very much. Last year, I spent 1 year in Kyoto to work with Professor Takezawa, and I'm very glad to be back to Kyoto. And thank you, Professor Takezawa and Tokyo Daigaku. Today, I'd like to talk about the miserable history of Baekjeong. They were regarded as being the most despised and stigmatized people, even by other despised people in traditional Korean society. They were socially isolated from and suppressed by other members of the society. Joseon Dynasty, which dominated Korean peninsula from the 14th century to the early 20th century, with Confucian ideas, incorporated a rigid status hierarchy called Shinbun system. In the Shinbun system, one's social relations and public issues, duties, and even one's occupation depended on their Shinbun, which was ascribed at birth and was passed from generation to generation. The inherited and unchanging Shinbun determined all aspects of social conventions and undoubtedly influenced all people's lives, in which they were forced to have a strict code of conduct and to obey unfair social conventions. It naturally brought about unequal relationships among all members of society and further reinforced social inequality. In a broad but decisive ways, all aspects of social life were ordered in a hierarchical system. Under the system, population was divided into 4 main hierarchical ranks. The top is under Yangban, the aristocrats or literati. The Jungin, second rank was Jungin, middle people. Third one, Yangmin, Sangmin, common people. And the bottom, there was Chunmin, the despised people. Baekjeong, which I'd like to talk about today, was regarded as being the lowest rank, even among the lowest despised people. In this sense, the Baekjeong of Joseon society may be broadly compared with the untouchable Dalit of India and the Brahmin of Japan. Who were Baekjeong? How did they suffer from under these social conventions? Why were they suppressed and discriminated against? These questions require investigation into social background and historical processes in which the group came to be segregated from the rest members of society during the Joseon period. Baekjeong was distinguished from others by occupations. Broadly speaking, they were involved in working in 2 main fields which did not have connection with each other. One of their main means of livelihood was to slaughter and butcher animals, mainly domestic animals. Some Baekjeong utilized their skills to carry out hunting of animals by moving from place to place. The slaughtering of animals naturally extended to other related jobs, one of which was leather work, specifically engaged in tanning leather and making leather shoes. Such leather craftsmanship was passed from generation to generation as family work in specialized groups with social recognition as professionals. Their butchery work and its related jobs were, in fact, not a sufficient source of income for their survival. This was particularly evident regarding the slaughtering of cattle because the area of cattle breeding was insufficiently developed at the time, and slaughtering cattle was strictly under the control of the government. the private slaughtering of cattle was nominally prohibited. In the agricultural sector of Joseon society, cattle was the main resource for farming, and then slaughtering opportunities and facilities remains poorly developed even up to the end until the late Joseon period. Accordingly, slaughtering provided only a meager source of income in their lives. In this situation, most of Baekjeong sought a subsidiary source of income in work to make weaker work during willow. Even though this had no connection with butchering or other related work, it obviously became a part of their inherited occupational history. They lived along riverside and around the marshes to easily find materials, mainly willow branches, for their work. Accordingly, they moved from place to place to find material for their work. Their nomadic lifestyle appeared agile in a specialized group of itinerant entertainers who were provide music and performed dances, moving from village to village. The itinerant entertainers developed their musical and instrumental skills, which contributed to differentiating them from other groups, even with their specializing on the job. They were found supplementary work in the production of weaker products, such as basketry, trunks, and window fans. Thus, it was common that some Baekjeong had 2 or 3 jobs. Even though most of Baekjeong were involved in various occupations, they were obviously living a poor conditions in Joseon society. In the long tradition of the Buddhist, Goryeo, and Confucian Joseon societies, their inherited works of slaughtering and butchering of animals were not considered to be an honorable profession, even though eating meat was not prohibited in Goryeo and Joseon societies. The Buddhist ideas of killing any life was considered sinful, and Confucian morality regarded cruel jobs like the slaughtering of animals as being menial. Such religious views and beliefs provoked to develop social prejudice against their jobs in the society. Social perception of their occupations as being menial and impure gave them their lasting and marketed identity and labeled them as outcasts. In these circumstances, social prejudice against them was formulated and contributed to reinforcing social conventions that isolated, stigmatized, discriminated against them in daily life. On the other hand, due to their inherited customs and nomadic life moving from place to place, they were also distinguished from rest members of society. Baekjeong did not reside with ordinary people in the villages, but along riversides or around the marshes. While the majority of society settled down in the villages and works in agriculture for their basic means of livelihood. In the circumstances, Baekjeong continued to be marginalized and isolated from others in the agrarian society, and then to be placed in their social status as being the lowest in Joseon society. Social prejudice against social prejudice against Baekjeong was also made and reinforced by the invention of image as the Baekjeong as anti-social group through labeling and criminal potentials. There were repeated reports in the King's documentary files that Baekjeong committed various crimes such as robbery, the slaughtering of cattle, and the purchasing of meats through illegal means. They were also suspected of committing crimes such as murders and even being fugitives from justice, and furthermore, organizing criminal gangs that victimized other people. These frequent reports by king's servants are supposed to be reflect social unrest at that time. The Baekjeong was also depicted as conducting a variety of wrongdoings, such as begging and wandering in groups without a primary settlement, peeping into private houses, and committing robbery. Furthermore, they were accused of committing sexual violation against ordinary women. On occasions, Baekjeong were reported for engaging in prostitution while performing as itinerant entertainers in the villages. Their alleged deviant, antisocial, and immoral activities could not be allowed in Confucius society. In fact, collective gang activities and criminal acts took place in virtually every corner of the country, especially during the 15th and 16th century. In this situation, those committed to breaking the regulations on the matter was not only Baekjeong, but also ordinary farmers. Such offenders could be those who had difficulties in sustaining livelihood from their earnings. In these circumstances, the ruling group attempted to charge Baekjeong for their crimes and to punish them harshly with extreme penalties, including death, for their criminal offenses. In the basis on such charge, all Baekjeong as potential offenders were forced to segregate and placed under surveillance from ordinary people. There are, of course, highly speculative assumptions that Baekjeong were easily induced into joining criminal activities in order to earn a living. Baekjeong did not have a proper means of earning a living except for their inherited work, so that they suffered under an impoverished situation of social suppression of discrimination. Nonetheless, Baekjeong were generally dealt the strongest blame and suspected of committing these criminal violations, usually on the basis of social prejudice. In short, along with the social prejudice against them based on their unusual occupations and nomadic lifestyles distinguished from one of the majority, Baekjeong became marginalized from others working on agriculture, which made them easy target for repeated social ridicule. And these prejudices were further developed to cause the injustices, segregation, and suppression against them. Moreover, it was worth noting that social prejudice against Baekjeong was made to diffuse based on social perception of their alien roots. Despite the obscurity of their roots, such social prejudice was pervasive throughout the society, with various terminology used to describe Baekjeong, such as different race from ours, different species, and peculiar groups, as it appeared in King's files. As a consequence, Baekjeong were, for all practice purposes, treated as sort of different race by other members of society, although the Baekjeong did not have any distinct physical features that differentiated from others. Through this process of intentional racial labeling, they were further marginalized and excluded from the mainstream society. These references to their origins as alien migrations even triggers for the royal servants to have suspicions that they were connected to, or at the very least collaborating with enemies from northern countries. These suspicions regarding the Baekjeong's racial origins and its related prejudice yielded social conventions in which they were segregated from rest of population and further was suppressed with the meaner general social climates of xenophobia. There were, however, no concrete theories on their origin. One can only partially trace their origins in Korean history through scattered, desperate, and incomplete record. Nonetheless, there are historians who claim Baekjeong's alien origins. Their claims are mainly based on archival sources written by royal servants during the Joseon dynasty, in particular from the scattered document of king's files. In the records, king's servant often mentioned Baekjeong as alien race, different species from us, or different species. However, there was no clue why they were called with such labeling except the basis of rumors or legend record. There are not also any relevant evidences which can verify the trace of their historical movements or tracks from other countries. The historians attempt as well to find evidence of their claim by analogical inferences of customs and lifestyle between the northern tribes of China and Yang Baekjeong. Accordingly, they insist that the ancestors of Baekjeong were immigrants from northern China, noting that Baekjeong's peculiar customs differ from the majority of society. Because they did not settle down and take up farming, they argue, Baekjeong were not accepted and failed to integrate with the local inhabitants. Their nomadic and gypsy-like lifestyle was obviously not welcomed by the residents of agrarian society on the Korean peninsula. On the basis of historical fact that Mongolians invaded Korea in the mid-13th century, and then some stayed in the Korean peninsula, Mongolians who remains is also claimed to become the Baekjeong. Tar Baekjeong is believed to include that the Baekjeong originally from the Tar, the meaning the Chinese tribe in the northern area of Manchuria. Despite references to historical archives, there are still some vague points in these aforementioned claims. Above all things, these did not fit in with historical sequences. It is apparent that the term Baekjeong first appeared in 1423 when King Sejong approved remaining of the outcast groups. And the term Tar Baekjeong first appeared in the middle period of Joseon dynasty. However, records on their ancestors were traced back to 10th century, 3 centuries before the Mongolian invasion of the 13th century, and at least 4 centuries before the foundation of Joseon dynasty. Therefore, we can make it sure that the term was invented to indicate the outcast on the basis of racial prejudice. It is worth noting that geographical location of Baekjeong scattered throughout the Korean peninsula. Particularly in the southern part, there have been not found reliable documents, records, or even concrete statistical figures which reveal the Baekjeong situation during the period of Joseon dynasty. Only these figures, which derives from surveys conducted by Japanese colonial authorities in the 1920s, offer the most relevant information revealing the size and regional allocations and occupational composition of the Baekjeong. These surveys, which give some insight on the situation of the Baekjeong in the early 20th century, show that there are regional variations in their areas of inhabitation. Although there are severe discrepancy in some aspects of these records, we can find that the majority of Baekjeong lived in the southern parts of the peninsula, comparing with less than 10% of Baekjeong in the northern provinces neighboring China, as shown at the map. From these records of their location, it can be speculated that the majority of Baekjeong resided in the southern part of Korea country, and that they did not have any connection with northern neighboring countries. Therefore, claims of Baekjeong aliens' origins cannot be substantiated by their geographical location. In short, various claims, either from legend or interpreted from historical documents, cannot be validated with historical events or social conventions, and consequently do not clearly explain the origins of Baekjeong. Furthermore, these proposed claims on their origins do not help explain the social mechanisms which rendered them to be being the lowest, most despised and stigmatized group in Joseon society. Considering the fact that they were obviously indistinguishable in physical appearances from the rest of members of Korean society, it is rather presumptuous to assert that their alien origins were the cause of their exploitation and stigmatization in society. As a consequence, the reasons for their social discrimination and exclusion in Joseon society still remain in question, and a different perspective is needed to explain the matter. I'd like to move to the rationalization of Baekjeong. The rationalization of Baekjeong contributed to place them the lowest status in the society. And this was even reinforced and institutionalized in daily life with diverse forms, even by legal apparatus as well as in social customs. It is astonishing that there are attempted reform to integrate the outcast group of the Korean period with members of society in the early years of the Joseon dynasty. These reforms were ultimately designated to elevate their social status to the upper rank, different from the previous one of the outcast group in Goryeo dynasty. King Sejong at the time allowed the remaining of their appellation to the Baekjeong in 1423, along with the strongly advocated reforms, forcing the intermarriage with ordinary commoners and by providing surplus land to Baekjeong families. The government also attempted to register them in official government records with some benefit, such as exemption from compulsory labor and the payment of government tributes. Behind these government strategies was the intention of a newly established Joseon dynasty in order to enlarge the scope and the numbers of youngin for revenue and military resources in building a new dynasty. However, King Sejong's attempt to impose reforms on these outcasts were eventually in vain. In the early period of Joseon dynasty, there were two contrasting social trends in dealing with the matters of Baekjeong outcast groups. One was to attempt to assimilate them with society, and the other was to exclude them from the society. The majority of society, including king's servants, did not easily accept the newly titled Baekjeong as their young fellows. They were also reluctant to marry them and even to interact with them in daily life. As a consequence, the Baekjeong remains a distinctive social group, segregated from the rest of the members of society. The failure of such reforms serves to reinforce ongoing public prejudice and suppression. While strongly opposing the designated reform, they depicted the Baekjeong as an alien race or a different race from themselves in their argument to segregate Baekjeong from ordinary villagers. These prejudices became further institutionalized in social customs and mores. Their changing social circumstances, the formation of social prejudice against them, and the institutionalization of their social exclusion contributed to transforming this despised group into invisible race in Joseon society. Such segregation and social exclusion against them formally appeared in a compilation of laws published in 1474, 15 years after King Sejong's reform of 1423 were introduced. The legislation was basically aimed to strengthen the Shinbun system, which provided for the some justification for this kind of social conventions. Through this legislation, Joseon dynasty enacted a provision to enforce Baekjeong to live collectively outside of ordinary residential areas. Such legislation obviously contributed to keeping Baekjeong a distance from ordinary people and under tight surveillance. In a sense, these actions reflect their anxiety and fears, mainly based on false imagination and prejudice of Baekjeong, who would bring about social unrest and instability if they moved into and lived nearby ordinary residential areas. This was intentional effort to marginalize and segregate the Baekjeong from society as a whole. These social conventions, which brought about social exclusion of the Baekjeong from the majority of society, were institutionalized in diverse ways of their life, from birth to death, even after demise. The Baekjeong was basically treated as being inferior all levels of social interaction. A proper example can be found in the relationships between persons based on Confucian ideas, which generally speaking include a wide range of strictly prescribed and adhered to behavior in Joseon society. The people of lower status had to behave with extreme modesty and deference toward their superiors in accordance with prevailing morals and conventions. All such practices toward the Baekjeong were even more strict and severe, especially for all the rest of upper groups being superior to the outcast ones. As the most inferior and menial groups, Baekjeong were required to be extremely modest and to show the most ultimately humility toward all others in institutional relations and in personal contact. They were not allowed to join public meetings with commoners. They were prohibited from drinking alcohols with ordinary people and from smoking in their presence. This kind of social discrimination and differentiation prevailed in the older society. So all Baekjeong, in the language form, all Baekjeong used a higher form of language when they addressing ordinary people, even children. And all non-Baekjeong responded to them in a lower form. And social discrimination against the Baekjeong were also expressed through differences in wedding and funeral services, which are ritual of deep significance in Joseon society. Baekjeong brides and bridegrooms were forbidden to mount saddles, horses, or to use covered palanquins, which were customary at other people's weddings. That kind of customs happened in funeral services. In short, Baekjeong were forced to obey social customs of strict suppression and discrimination. Otherwise, any breaches were met by severe sanctions. Collectively, society as a whole punished Baekjeong through autonomous community organizations for public security. These mechanisms contributed to the maintenance of a hierarchical Shinbun system, which kept Joseon dynasty from falling. It was an indication that Shinbun system was one of key in bringing about and maintaining the discriminatory social customs, conventions against the Baekjeong, who was forced to place at the bottom rank in society. I'd like to conclude just 1 minute. In fact, all members of Joseon society, including Baekjeong, could not be distinguished from another by external shape of their bodies or the color of skins. Nonetheless, throughout the continued negative labeling by the Shinbun, the Baekjeong group were regarded as being a different people from other members of the society. On the basis of the Shinbun system, in which social inequality was justified for maintaining social order, Baekjeong's lower status was solidified within Joseon society. The hierarchy of the Shinbun system was imposed and maintained through enforced social conventions. That is, Shinbun's hierarchy did not emerge in a natural way, but rather through social engineering. Shinbun represent mechanism whereby all human beings were socially classified. As a consequence of this, they were fossilized into unequal social relationships, thereby transforming social inequality into what seemingly became a part of the natural order. In this sense, the concept of Shinbun in hierarchical Joseon society could be seen as a racially discriminatory system which forcibly designated all human beings into unequal social and economic relationships. The Shinbun system was all intent and purposes a modified structure of racism in traditional Joseon society. In these circumstances, Baekjeong was suppressed and discriminated against. They are classified as outcasts, different race from the rest of society, and thus became the invisible and despised minority in traditional society. Actually, I'd like to talk about the current situation of Baekjeong in Korea, contemporary Korea, I mean, but I have no time, sorry. Thank you very much.